The 26-year-old English teacher had spent years preparing for this moment, earning her master's degree in education with honors, developing innovative curriculum plans, and practicing classroom management techniques. What no preparation could have readied her for was becoming the target of systematic workplace harassment by the very colleagues she had hoped would mentor her. Elise had always struggled with anxiety. Public speaking made her palms sweat and her voice waver, but her passion for literature and her desire to inspire young minds had driven her to pursue teaching despite these challenges. She had developed coping mechanisms, deep breathing exercises, thorough preparation, and visualization techniques that helped her manage classroom presentations. But facing a roomful of teenagers was somehow less intimidating than navigating the cold hostility of the English department's veteran teachers. Sarah Matthews, the department head with 27 years of experience, had taken an immediate dislike to Elise. Perhaps it was the innovative teaching methods Elise had enthusiastically shared during her interview, or the principal's comment about bringing fresh perspectives to an established program. Whatever the catalyst, Sarah had marked Elise as an outsider from day one, and where Sarah led, Diane Winters and Thomas Blackwell followed. The first week had been subtle: exclusion from lunch invitations, conversations that abruptly shifted when Elise approached, and critical glances when she spoke during faculty meetings. By the second week, the tactics escalated. Elise would arrive to find her classroom door locked, though she was certain she'd left it open. Her carefully prepared handouts would mysteriously disappear from the copy room, forcing her to improvise lessons. Students would mention comments other teachers had made about her inexperience and experimental methods. "Don't take it personally," advised the school counselor, Marcus, the only staff member who showed her any kindness. "They do this to every new teacher under 30. It's like a hazing ritual." But it felt personal when Sarah would loudly sigh and roll her eyes whenever Elise's hands trembled while presenting at department meetings. It felt targeted when Diane would correct Elise's teaching approaches in front of students during classroom observations. And it certainly felt deliberate when Thomas began sending emails to parents questioning the rigor of Elise's curriculum, copying the principal but conveniently forgetting to include Elise. The psychological effects accumulated like sediment in a once clear stream. Elise began doubting teaching decisions she would have made confidently during her student teaching. She started arriving at school an hour earlier to ensure she had time to handle any surprises left by her colleagues. She stopped contributing ideas in meetings after watching Sarah take her suggestions, dismiss them publicly, then implement them weeks later as her own innovations. By October, Elise had developed insomnia. She would lie awake replaying interactions, wondering what she could have said differently or how she might earn her colleagues' respect. Her anxiety, once manageable, began spilling into her classroom performance. She dropped her dry erase markers when Sarah made unscheduled observations. She stumbled over literary terms she knew intimately when Diane brought the vice principal to evaluate her classroom control issues. The students noticed. Some, sensing vulnerability, began testing boundaries they wouldn't have dared challenge in other teachers' classrooms. Others, particularly those who struggled with their own social anxieties, seemed to recognize a kindred spirit and became protective of Miss Chun. "They're just jealous because you actually care if we learn," offered Zoe, a perceptive junior, after witnessing Thomas interrupt Elise's class to borrow the anthology sets she had reserved weeks in advance. The teacher's lounge became a territory Elise avoided entirely after overhearing Sarah's stage-whispered comment. "Some people just aren't cut out for teaching. Not everyone with a degree has the backbone for actual classroom management." The isolation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the bullying. Teaching had always been portrayed as a collaborative profession, but Elise found herself completely alone. Other newer teachers, witnessing her treatment, kept their distance, fearful of being associated with the department pariah. Veteran teachers from other departments seemed uncomfortable intervening in what they viewed as English department politics. By Thanksgiving break, Elise had lost 12 pounds from her already slender frame. Her mother, during their holiday dinner, had asked with alarm if she was ill. Elise had brushed it off as first-year teaching stress, unable to admit that at 26, she was being bullied so severely that she'd begun looking at job listings outside of education entirely. The The betrayal of her professional dream felt almost as painful as the daily torment. Since childhood, Elise had imagined creating a classroom where literature opened new worlds for students, where discussions fostered critical thinking, and where even reluctant readers might discover the power of well-crafted words. Instead, she found herself in survival mode, focusing more on avoiding her tormentors than on developing her teaching practice. What Sarah, Diane, and Thomas didn't realize, couldn't have known, was that Elise was no stranger to adversity. Her anxiety had led her parents to enroll her in martial arts classes at age 14, hoping physical discipline might help her develop mental resilience. What began as therapy evolved into passion. For 8 years, Elise had trained in mixed martial arts, eventually competing at regional levels. The trembling hands that her colleagues mocked had, on numerous occasions, executed takedowns against opponents twice her size. But Elise had always separated these aspects of her life. In the dojo, she was confident, centered, and formidable. In her professional life, she sought collaboration rather than confrontation. She had never wanted to bring the combative aspects of her training into her teaching career. She believed education should be about building up, not taking down. As winter settled over Westlake Academy, Elise's resolve was being tested daily. The bullying had become so normalized that even the principal seemed to accept it as typical departmental dynamics. When Elise had finally gathered the courage to report some of the more blatant incidents, she was told to develop thicker skin, and reminded that her contract renewal would depend on her ability to integrate with the school culture. The message was clear: endure the abuse or leave the profession. For someone whose anxiety had always manifested as flight rather than fight, the situation was becoming untenable. Yet somewhere beneath the self-doubt and exhaustion, a familiar sensation was building, the same centered calm she found when facing an opponent across the mat. The bullies had targeted her because they perceived weakness. They had never bothered to look deeper, to recognize that some people develop strength precisely because they have faced vulnerability. As the winter break approached and the faculty gathered for the end-of-semester meeting, Elise felt something shifting within her. But Elise had always separated these aspects of her life. In the dojo, she was confident, centered, and formidable. In her professional life, she sought collaboration rather than confrontation. She had never wanted to bring the combative aspects of her training into her teaching career. She believed education should be about building up, not taking down. As winter settled over Westlake Academy, Elise's resolve was being tested daily. The bullying had become so normalized that even the principal seemed to accept it as typical departmental dynamics. When Elise had finally gathered the courage to report some of the more blatant incidents, she was told to develop thicker skin, and reminded that her contract renewal would depend on her ability to integrate with the school culture. The message was clear: endure the abuse or leave the profession. For someone whose anxiety had always manifested as flight rather than fight, the situation was becoming untenable. Yet somewhere beneath the self-doubt and exhaustion, a familiar sensation was building, the same centered calm she found when facing an opponent across the mat. The bullies had targeted her because they perceived weakness. They had never bothered to look deeper, to recognize that some people develop strength precisely because they have faced vulnerability. As the winter break approached and the faculty gathered for the end-of-semester meeting, Elise felt something shifting within her. Sarah was presenting the department's standardized test results, carefully highlighting the improvements in her own advanced classes while glossing over the remarkable progress Elise's basic sections had shown. Watching Sarah manipulate data to diminish her achievements, Elise realized that this wasn't just about personal dislike. This was about power, about maintaining a hierarchy that valued conformity over student success. And in that moment, the division between Elise, the anxious teacher, and Elise, the disciplined martial artist, began to dissolve. The breaking point came during the spring faculty meeting in late March. The auditorium hummed with end-of-quarter tension as teachers from every department gathered to review student progress data and discuss upcoming standardized testing protocols. Elise sat alone in the back row, a position that had become her norm, close enough to be counted present, far enough to avoid direct confrontation with her tormentors. Principal Winters had just finished his opening remarks when Sarah Matthews stood, smoothing her tailored blazer with manicured fingers. Before we move to departmental reports, I'd like to address a concerning trend in our English language arts preliminary assessment scores. Elisa's spine stiffened. She knew what was coming before Sarah even clicked to the first slide of her unauthorized presentation. As you can see, Sarah continued, gesturing to a graph that highlighted a specific class section scores in red. We have one section significantly underperforming compared to their peers. These students are falling behind state benchmarks despite having comparable entry scores to other sections. The red section was Elisa's remedial English class, a group of struggling readers she'd been specifically assigned because no other teacher wanted them. Students with learning disabilities, English language learners, and those dealing with serious home issues had been bundled together and dropped in the new teacher's lap with minimal support. Our department has a reputation for excellence. Sarah's voice carried theatrical concern. We need to consider whether experimental teaching methods are appropriate for our most vulnerable students. Perhaps some of our newer staff would benefit from returning to traditional approaches rather than trying to reinvent established pedagogy. A few teachers shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew exactly who was being criticized. Sarah wasn't finished. In particular, I'm concerned about emotional regulation in the classroom. She clicked to a new slide showing an email complaint from a parent, one Elise had never seen. When teachers demonstrate anxiety and nervousness, it creates an unstable learning environment. Students need confidence and authority, not. She paused dramatically. Someone who belongs in special education rather than teaching it. The room fell silent. Even those accustomed to Sarah's tactics seemed shocked by the cruelty of the attack. Something shifted in Elisa's body. The familiar pre-competition calm washed over her. That moment before a match when perception sharpens and time seems to slow. She rose from her seat, her movements so fluid and controlled that several teachers turned in surprise. May I respond to these concerns? Her voice, usually soft and hesitant in these settings, carried clearly through the auditorium without a hint of tremor. Principal Winters, clearly uncomfortable, nodded. Briefly, Ms. Chun, we have a full agenda. Elise walked to the front of the room, her posture perfectly aligned in a way that her martial arts sensei would have approved. She stood beside Sarah rather than retreating to the opposite side of the presentation screen, close enough that Sarah instinctively stepped back. I'd like to address both the data and the commentary. Elise connected her own laptop to the projector with smooth efficiency. First, let's look at the complete dataset rather than a selected snapshot. Her screen showed the same student section but with two additional graph lines, one showing where these students had started the year, and another showing their growth percentage. My students began the year significantly below grade level, on average 2.3 years behind their peers. This information was omitted from the previous presentation. Her voice remained measured, neither defensive nor accusatory. Their current scores still lag behind grade level, yes, but they've shown an average growth of 1.7 grade levels in 7 months. More than double the expected rate of progress. Murmurs spread through the audience as teachers registered what the data actually revealed. Elisa's supposedly underperforming class was actually showing remarkable improvement. As for my teaching methods, she continued, clicking to a new slide showing detailed lesson plans alongside student work samples. They are evidence-based approaches specifically designed for struggling readers, approved by the district literacy coordinator. She nodded toward Dr. Reynolds, who had been her graduate school advisor and who looked surprised to be suddenly included in this confrontation. I've documented every intervention, modification, and accommodation. Elisa's hands, so often the target of mockery for their trembling, moved with precision as she displayed a digital portfolio organized with meticulous care. I've also maintained communication logs with parents, which is how I know the complaint email shown earlier was actually withdrawn 2 days after it was sent, when the parent observed their child's progress firsthand. She turned directly to Sarah now, maintaining steady eye contact. I've respected your seniority and experience for 7 months, Ms. Matthews. I've endured locked classrooms, missing materials, and public humiliation. I've watched as you, Ms. Winters, and Mr. Blackwell systematically undermined my reputation with colleagues, parents, and students. Elise reached into her bag and removed a slim folder. "What you didn't know is that I've documented every incident." She handed copies of the first page to Principal Winters and the department chairs. "This includes dates, times, witnesses, and supporting evidence of what can only be described as workplace harassment." Thomas Blackwell half rose from his seat, his face flushed. "This is ridiculous. You can't possibly." "Page 3, Mr. Blackwell." Elise's calm didn't waver. "The emails you sent to parents questioning my curriculum, but failed to copy me on. I've included the original messages showing metadata timestamps and recipient lists. Page 4 shows where sections of my lesson plans appeared verbatim in Ms. Winters' model teaching demonstration, 3 weeks after she criticized those same approaches as pedestrian and ineffective in my evaluation." The room had fallen so silent that the sound of papers being turned seemed thunderous. Diane Winters had gone pale, staring at the evidence in front of her. "You targeted me because my hands shake when I'm nervous," Elise said, holding them out now, perfectly steady. "But you never bothered to learn why they're steady when it matters most." She turned to address the entire faculty. "I came to Westlake because I believe in education's power to transform lives. I believe teachers should build each other up, not tear each other down. I've never wanted confrontation. In fact, I've avoided it my entire life." She squared her shoulders, her stance subtly shifting into the balanced readiness that had served her well in countless matches. "But I've learned that sometimes, failing to confront bullying only enables it to continue. Every student in this school deserves teachers who model integrity, collaboration, and respect. How can we expect students to stand up to bullies when we allow it among ourselves?" Principal Winters cleared his throat, clearly blindsided by both the evidence and Elise's transformation. "Ms. Chun, this is concerning material. I think we need to adjourn the general meeting and continue this discussion privately with the involved parties. With respect, sir, this happened publicly, for 7 months, with the knowledge of everyone in this room." Elise's voice remained respectful but firm. "I'm not interested in private meetings where these behaviors can be minimized or dismissed as personality conflicts. What I want is acknowledgement, accountability, and assurance that no other new teacher will face what I have faced." From the back of the room, the school counselor Marcus spoke up. "She's right. We've all seen it happening. We just didn't have the courage to say anything." One by one, other teachers began to nod or voice agreement. The school librarian described materials repeatedly checked out in Elise's name without her knowledge. A science teacher mentioned overhearing Sarah instructing students to test Ms. Chen's patience before her observation class. By the meeting's end, the 3 bullies sat in shocked silence. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, toppled by the quiet strength of the woman they had so grievously underestimated. As teachers filed out, many stopped to offer Elise words of support or quiet apologies for their previous silence. She accepted each with the same centered calm she had maintained throughout her stand. Dr. Reynolds, the literacy coordinator, was the last to approach. "That was masterful, Elise. Not just the evidence, but the way you handled yourself." Elise smiled slightly. 8 years of martial arts teaches you a lot about confrontation, when to avoid it, and when it's necessary." "Martial arts?" Dr. Reynolds looked surprised. "MMA, actually. I compete regionally." Elise shouldered her bag. "My sensei always said the strongest opponents are those who have had to overcome themselves first." As she walked to her car that evening, Elise felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and liberation. The battle had been won, but the war against workplace bullying was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: rebuilding professional relationships, establishing boundaries, and continuing to advocate for a healthier school culture. But for the first time since joining Westlake Academy, her hands didn't tremble at the thought of walking through those doors. She had finally brought her whole self to the classroom, the dedicated teacher and the disciplined fighter, the anxious young woman and the centered competitor. In doing so, she had found strength she hadn't known she possessed. The aftermath of what came to be known simply as the meeting rippled through Westlake Academy with the force of a seismic event. For days afterward, conversations in the teacher's lounge fell silent whenever Elise entered. not from hostility but from a newfound respect tinged with collective shame. Her colleagues' eyes now held admiration mixed with regret, the uncomfortable recognition that they had witnessed injustice and done nothing. Within a week, the administration was forced to address what could no longer be ignored. The district superintendent arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by the head of human resources and a workplace conflict specialist. They commandeered the conference room for 3 days of interviews, reviewing Elise's meticulously documented evidence and gathering testimony from staff members who suddenly found their voices. Sarah Matthews was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Thomas Blackwell requested an immediate transfer to another school in the district. Diane Winters, perhaps the least malicious of the three but no less complicit, submitted a handwritten letter of apology that sat unopened on Elise's desk for 2 days before she found the grace to read it. "I followed because I was afraid," Diane had written in shaking script. 20 years in education, and I still behaved like the insecure teenager who lets others bully because she's grateful not to be the target. That's not the example I want to set for my students or my own children. Principal Winters faced his own reckoning. His failure to address the harassment despite multiple signals revealed a leadership blind spot that the district could not overlook. He wasn't fired, but the performance improvement plan placed in his file made clear that his future at Westlake depended on meaningful change. For Elise, the vindication brought complexity rather than simple triumph. She hadn't wanted careers destroyed or reputations shattered. She had only wanted dignity, respect, and the space to become the teacher she knew she could be. "What happens now?" she asked Marcus during a quiet moment in the counselor's office, where she had begun taking her lunch to escape the awkward reverence that followed her through the hallways. "Now," he said thoughtfully, "you get to decide what victory looks like. Real victory, not just winning the fight." The question stayed with her as April blossomed into May, as her students continued their remarkable progress, and as the school community began the painful process of healing. What did victory look like beyond the removal of her tormentors? What lasting change could emerge from this painful chapter? The answer began to take shape during a district-mandated professional development day focused on workplace culture and communication. The consultant leading the session, Dr. Yamamoto, had invited Elise to coffee beforehand. "Your situation has created an opening," the consultant said, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "Schools are hierarchical by nature, years of service, tenure status, department rankings. In toxic environments, those hierarchies become weapons. But in healthy ones, they can be scaffolding for growth." Elise considered this. "So the structure itself isn't the problem." "Exactly. The question is whether the structure supports people or suppresses them." Dr. Yamamoto studied Elise with keen interest. "The faculty respects you now. You have influence you didn't have before. How will you use it?" The workshop that followed was predictably uncomfortable. Teachers squirming through role plays of difficult conversations, administrators nervously documenting action items for cultural improvement. But during the small group discussions, something unexpected happened. Teachers began sharing their own stories of intimidation, isolation, and fear. The science department chair confessed to driving away 3 promising young teachers because they had questioned his traditional methods. A veteran English teacher admitted implementing reading interventions in secret because Sarah had ridiculed them as coddling. Pattern after pattern emerged: the silencing of innovation, the protection of territory, the fear of appearing vulnerable or uncertain. And beneath it all, the students who ultimately suffered when adults couldn't model the very values they were tasked with teaching. As the session concluded, Dr. Yamamoto invited final thoughts. Elise, who had remained mostly quiet throughout the day, finally stood. "We talk about teaching as a calling," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We tell ourselves we do this work because we care about young people, about learning, about the future. But somewhere along the way, many of us started caring more about being right, about status, about power." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of colleagues who had once seemed so intimidating. "I'm not exempt from this. When I was targeted, my first instinct wasn't to address it directly for the good of our school community. It was to withdraw, to protect myself, to endure until I could escape." She drew a steadying breath. What if we created a different model? What if Westlake became known not just for academic excellence, but for professional excellence? A place where teachers support each other's growth instead of fearing it. Where innovation is welcomed rather than threatening. Where vulnerability is seen as courage rather than weakness. The silence that followed felt electric rather than awkward. That sounds idealistic, Principal Winters said finally. But where would we even begin? With accountability, Elise replied. Starting with me. I handled a professional conflict by gathering evidence in secret for months instead of seeking resolution. Yes, I was afraid, and yes, the power dynamics were against me. But I still had choices. She turned to face him directly. And with you, Mr. Winters, you saw what was happening and chose the path of least resistance. We all need to acknowledge our part in creating the culture we have before we can build the one we want. 2 weeks later, Sarah Matthews requested a meeting with Elise. They sat at a small coffee shop 10 miles from school, neutral territory where neither held home advantage. I've been teaching longer than you've been alive, Sarah said after they had settled with their drinks. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing new teachers as colleagues and started seeing them as threats. She stared into her cup. Especially the good ones. Elise waited, giving Sarah space to continue. The district has offered me early retirement or probationary return following suspension. Sarah looked up, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Before I decide, I wanted to hear what you think I should do. That's not my decision to make, Elise said carefully. No, but your opinion matters to me. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Ironic, considering how hard I worked to convince you that it shouldn't. Elise considered her response carefully. I think you're an exceptional teacher when you're not afraid. Your students consistently perform well because you know your subject deeply and you hold high standards. Those are valuable contributions to any school. She leaned forward slightly. But I also think you've been unhappy for a long time, and you've spread that unhappiness to others. Only you know if you're willing to do the work to change that pattern. Sarah nodded slowly. Fair enough. She pulled a folder from her bag, a mirror image of the one Elise had presented during the meeting. I've written formal apologies to everyone I've targeted over the years. There are 27 letters here, going back 15 years. Elise's eyes widened slightly. Once I started looking at my behavior honestly, I couldn't stop seeing the pattern. Sarah pushed the folder across the table. Would you be willing to review them before I send them? I want to make sure they offer real accountability, not just performative remorse. It was the last thing Elise had expected, this proud woman asking for guidance from the colleague she had tried so hard to destroy. Yes, she said simply. I can do that. By the time the school year ended, the transformation at Westlake Academy was palpable. The district had implemented a comprehensive anti-bullying program for staff, not just students. New mentoring structures paired veteran teachers with newcomers in relationships of mutual learning rather than one-way instruction. Anonymous reporting mechanisms had been established, with clear protocols for addressing concerns at every level. Sarah had chosen to return under probation, humbled but determined to become part of the solution. Her decades of experience, once wielded as a weapon, now served as valuable institutional memory during the change process. The journey wasn't smooth. Old habits resurfaced under stress, trust rebuilt slowly, and some wounds needed more time to heal, but progress was undeniable. For Elise, the most profound change came in an unexpected form. During the final faculty meeting of the year, Principal Winters announced a new initiative for the coming fall, an after-school program combining physical discipline with emotional regulation strategies. Ms. Chen has agreed to lead this program, he explained, bringing her expertise in mixed martial arts into a framework designed to help both students and staff develop resilience, confidence, and self-control. The proposal, which Elise had submitted on a whim, never expecting approval, received immediate support. Students who struggled with anxiety or anger management would have a constructive outlet. Teachers dealing with burnout or secondary trauma would gain concrete tools for self-regulation. And the skills that had once seemed separate from her teaching identity would finally be integrated into her professional life. On the last day of school, As students cleared out lockers and signed yearbooks, Zoe, the perceptive junior who had been among the first to recognize Elise's strength, stopped by her classroom. "My mom says you're the reason Ms. Matthews apologized to her," she said without preamble, "for telling her I wasn't college material at last year's conference." Elise smiled slightly. "Ms. Matthews made her own choices." "Maybe," Zoe shrugged. "But things are different now because of you. Even the teachers who never liked each other are at least being civil. It's weird." "Good weird or bad weird?" "Good weird." Zoe fidgeted with her backpack strap. "Anyway, I signed up for your MMA thing next year. My therapist thinks it might help with my anxiety." "Mine certainly does," Elise replied. "You have anxiety?" Zoe looked genuinely surprised. "But you always seem so, I don't know, centered." Elise laughed. "That's the secret no one tells you. The people who seem most calm are often the ones who've worked hardest to get there. The strongest people aren't those who never feel fear. They're the ones who've learned to stand firm despite it." As Zoe left, Elise turned to the window, watching students spill out into the summer sunshine. Her first year of teaching had been nothing like she'd imagined. Harder, more painful, more transformative than she could have anticipated. She had arrived as a nervous new teacher and would return in the fall as something more complex. Still a teacher, but also a mentor, an advocate, and a quiet revolutionary in a system that had needed disruption. She gathered her belongings, hands steady as she packed away lesson plans and student work. The classroom that had once felt like hostile territory now held possibility. The colleagues who had once seemed like enemies now represented community. The weakness that had made her a target had revealed itself as her greatest strength. Sometimes standing up to bullies requires more than courage. It requires the vision to see beyond the fight, to the world that might exist when the fighting ends. Elise Chun had found that vision, not despite her anxiety but because of it. And in doing so, she had changed not just her own story, but the stories of everyone around her. The nervous new teacher had done more than take down her opponents like an MMA champion. She had transformed the very ring in which they fought.